Welcome to the Film Florida podcast. I'm John Lux, and I'm the Executive Director of Film Florida. Before we get to our interview, if you're not already a member of Film Florida, please consider joining at filmflorida.org. Please also consider going to our website and donating $20.26 for our 2026 fundraising campaign. Visit the Film Florida merchandise page at filmflorida.creator-spring.com to purchase Film Florida t-shirts, sweatshirts, coffee mugs, and more. All merchandise proceeds go to the Film Florida Filmmaker Grant and Scholarship Fund. Writer, producer, and director Joseph Greco is a Florida native and graduate of the Florida State University College of Motion Picture Arts. His first feature film, Canvas, starred Academy Award winner Marcia Harden and Emmy Award winner Joe Pantoliano, and is a personal story that focuses on a family dealing with mental health. Prior to that, Joe learned the business working for Oscar-winning director James Cameron and garnered awards of his own with his short film Lena's Spaghetti, which premiered in the Telluride Film Festival. We talk all of this and more on this episode of the Film Florida podcast. Here's my conversation with Joe Greco. Welcome to the Film Florida podcast, Joe.
Thanks for having me.
So give us your backstory. Help the audience get to know you a little bit and where you came from.
Yeah, well, I was born and raised in Hollywood, Florida. I grew up in a pretty typical middle-class neighborhood in Hollywood, and I was accepted to USC's film school, but decided to go to FSU. It was a lot cheaper and closer to home, and that really kept me anchored, I feel, as a Florida filmmaker.
Well, as a native Floridian, what are some of the early moments growing up here that made you kind of fall in love with storytelling and filmmaking that even had you looking into USC or FSU?
Well, my father was quite an interesting character. He's quite a dreamer. He was a Navy veteran and a sailor. He built 3 sailboats in our backyard, and so I guess I'm a literal son of a sailor.
Nice.
And he would take me sailing. He taught me how to sail in North Lake in Hollywood, and we would spend summers in the Florida Keys. So I grew up just really loving Florida as a place to enjoy the water. And my father was like I said, a big dreamer. He actually built these elaborate train sets in the garage, and was always tinkering, building remote control boats, and he was also a bit of a cinephile. He loved Frank Capra, John Ford movies, John Wayne movies. So whenever they were on TV, he was always showing me these films. And he also took me to the movies a lot. We spent a lot of time, I'd say every Friday or Saturday, we were at the movies. And some of that was to escape things that were going on with my mom, because my mom was battling a mental illness, and we could talk about that a little bit later. But he really encouraged me to dream and appreciate storytelling.
Yeah. So looking back, were there any particular local stories or people or places in South Florida that kind of planted that seed for you creatively?
Absolutely. Well, there was my 2 favorite movie theaters. I'll start with those. There was the Florida Twin, which was across from the Hollywood Mall, and Sheridan 7. Sadly, those 2 movie theaters are no longer around. But a couple of things really pushed me into storytelling. One was getting a magic kit as a kid. When I was 10 years old, I got this magic kit for Christmas, and I was very shy as a child and would sometimes stay in my bedroom. I wouldn't come out. It was just really afraid for me to engage. But I found that I was able to memorize the pattern of a magic trick, and performing magic tricks is in a sense a little bit of live theater, because you're telling a story. You're having to take an audience on a journey. And so my dad ended up driving me to Paul Diamond's magic shop in Fort Lauderdale all the time, because I just became addicted to learning a trick, memorizing it, and performing it. And so that was really influential, because it was a way for me to kind of get out of my comfort zone and again, craft stories. The second thing that happened was when I was in high school. Again, I was very shy, but I somehow found myself in the debate class. And this wonderful teacher, Mrs. Shepard, Carol Shepard, sort of plucked me out of the desk one day and said, "Look, I want you to memorize this play." And she handed me a Samuel French copy of Neil Simon's Plaza Suite. And she said, "Memorize all the parts because you're going to perform all the characters, choose the 10 minutes that you want. And there's a category in debate called humorous interpretation." And so thank God for her because I really took to it. I love this idea of looking at the written word and thanks to her encouragement, I ended up winning the state debate tournament that year in Novice State in Vero Beach, Florida. And the other thing that was interesting is she also had these screenplays in the classroom. And one day I found an old copy of On Golden Pond by Ernest Lehman, and I ended up bringing it home and getting an old copy of On Golden Pond on VHS and watching the movie while I read the script.
Mm.
And my eyes were open because this really reinforced this idea that the written word can elicit so much emotion. And I started to appreciate what a screenplay was, what a play was. And so those two things I think really had a big impact on me.
No, very good. Now, you mentioned you studied at FSU's College of Motion Picture Arts. What were those formative years like, both creatively and personally?
Well, I loved going to FSU. I met some of my best friends at FSU, one of whom I still work with and collaborate with. We met in the dorm and the suite that we were suite mates. So on a personal level, it was very impactful. I was also sheltered as a kid, so I think the idea of going away, even though it's still in Florida, it's about 7 hours from South Florida. So I was, again, out of my comfort zone. And but the other thing that's really wonderful about FSU and why I was very grateful and I feel like I appreciated that choice of going there versus somewhere like USC or NYU is that it's in the panhandle. And so you're away from the hustle and bustle of the industry and you could really explore the craft and art of making films. And you're encouraged there and still are to sort of not be afraid to fail. Just take risks because the stakes are low. You're in college. You can try things out. And so that time was very formative. I was able to direct a couple of short films that took me on wonderful journeys. I directed this lovely documentary, a short documentary with some friends called The Ghost of Drury Lane about this octogenarian theater manager at the famous Theater Royal Drury Lane in the West End who would tell these wonderful ghost stories and he would smile and say, maybe one day I'll haunt the theater. He has since passed away and they joke that he's still there. And then I directed this short film, Lena Spaghetti. I didn't write it. I just loved the story. It was written by someone else, but I just loved it because it reminded me of the film Marty, the Paddy Chayefsky film that Ernest Borgnine plays this sort of a hermetic guy who's afraid of connecting with others. And so I did that and it was invited to premiere at the Telluride Film Festival and the Filmmakers of Tomorrow program, where I got to meet some incredible people and you're standing in line with these filmmakers that you idolize. So it's just a beautiful time. So yeah, I think that making those films, learning to work with actors, learning to work within a finite amount of time and budget was very helpful.
Now, you mentioned Lena Spaghetti. I want to talk a little bit more in depth about the short films you made early on. You mentioned just a couple things right there, but overall, like, how do those experiences prepare you for the larger projects?
Great question. I should mention that there was also a screenwriting professor at FSU that I really am grateful for. Her name is Claudia Johnson, and she wrote this beautiful book, Stifled Laughter, that was nominated for a Pulitzer. And she was someone who really instilled in all of us as students to think about character. So when you're writing even a short film, this takes the same amount of brain power and craft to make a short that it does to make a feature. It's just a shorter duration. And it was really all about the story and the character. What would this character do? And thinking about story from a character perspective, I think was incredibly invaluable. And she started to encourage me to write my own story, which would later become Canvas, my first feature.
Excellent. You also gained a lot of early professional experience working with mentors like James Cameron. You often refer to this as your graduate school. What was the most impactful lessons that, some of these mentors have taught you about filmmaking?
Yeah, I was very fortunate to work for Jim, and so I learned a tremendous amount working for him. Ray Sankini, his producer, John Landau, who sadly is no longer with us, but I think that time was fantastic because it was during the time of Titanic, but he was also starting to write Avatar. And seeing Jim up close, I realized that even though his films are high on spectacle and there's always a lot of action, at their heart, really, they're emotional stories. They're character-based stories. Again, it's all about character. And, I think we all know that Titanic, at its heart, it's Romeo and Juliet set against the most famous maritime disaster. And that's really why I think that film is so timeless. And I think I learned really what it takes to put a movie together. It was such a big movie. And Jim is very fearless and he brings out the best in people, I think. He's very courageous, brave, and that fortitude, that stick-with-itness that you have to have as a filmmaker, I was grateful to see up close. And it wasn't just Jim. I mean, there all the craftspeople, all the crew that he worked with. And I grew up, in Florida. I grew up seeing his movies, but and also remember, True Lies was filmed in partially filmed in Florida. So the opportunity to work with him and watch how he is on set, but also, in the writing and post-production, that fearlessness carries through his process. It's not just on set. It's really figuring out what's the story and how best to tell it. And so I learned a great deal, and I was honored that he signed my DGA application. He was one of the directors that signed when I joined the Directors Guild. And I remember meeting him years later after I had left Lightstorm, and I was writing Canvas, because that's where I began writing. I'd work for Jim at Lightstorm during the day, and then at night I'd go home and began writing what became, my first feature. And I remember he would encourage me to think outside the box in terms of casting, which is one of the reasons why I chose to cast Joe Pantoliano against type. And also he would joke and say, "How's your little boat movie?" He was working on the, arguably the biggest boat movie ever, and here I was making a small film about a father and son who sail together. So yeah, I learned a lot, grateful for that time, and very excited for all he's doing.
Yeah. Now, outside of filmmaking, you also produced, wrote, and directed some commercial and branded content for the Walt Disney Company and their Disney Consumer Products division. Share a little bit about the highlights from that tenure and also the lessons that you took from that role into the filmmaking side.
Yeah, that was a fun time, and I have to give credit to one of my dear friends who I met at FSU. Ended up bringing me into the fold and introducing me to people. His name's John Rito, great guy, and he worked at Disney, and then he handed me off to another executive at Disney, and so while I was there, I would produce and sometimes direct and write these oftentimes very short pieces, 15 seconds, 30 minutes, all the way up to a more event-based productions that were quite a bit more money. And when you're making these things and making them often, I think that's where I learned to be a producer, to think about how to tell a story economically, how to tell it as inexpensively as you can, to stay on budget. That's huge. And also to engage with the clients and how to collaborate with people. Again, I learned that working for Jim, you have to be fearless and not be afraid to get input. I'm a firm believer in the collaborative spirit, and it doesn't just end with the writing. It continues throughout the movie process. So when you're making these shorts, you start to get a sense of, okay, this is how you make sure you hit your deadlines, deliver on time, on budget. And I think that was a sort of a producer muscle that I got to use, and hopefully makes me a better filmmaker when you're out there when the stakes are higher.
So let's talk about Canvas, your feature. What was the moment you knew this personal story had to become a feature film?
Yeah, I think that moment did come when I was working at Lightstorm. As I said, began writing that story, or actually tinkering with the idea when I was in film school, and then would write at night while I was working for Jim. And there's this moment where you're pushing a script, and then hopefully you stop pushing and it starts to pull you. And that started to happen. And it stopped being an exercise of creative expression and began to take on this life of, I think I want to do this. I want to make this movie. And I had it optioned several times by various producers. And then there came a point where I just started to ask myself, if I'm going to make this movie, I think I just have to find a way to do it myself, because there's nothing wrong with the development process, but you can spend years basically waiting for others to give you permission to make your film. And I became a little jaded with that, and there were people that had optioned it, that wanted to take the material into maybe a different direction, and so I decided, let me go make this. So, and I ended up coming back to Florida for a period of time, working in an architectural firm as an assistant, and paying the bills, and then continuing to raise money. I was meeting with people, and really began to discover that Florida community, and was grateful that I found my producers there, Sharon, Adam, Eddie, so many great people that saw the same thing. And so I think it was that time, and I need, again, if this is going to happen, I got to go make it myself.
Now, the story is about a family coping with mental illness, and that comes from lived experience, as you mentioned. How did you balance the emotional truth with artistic storytelling?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. Well, yeah, so Canvas is very personal. The story, for those who haven't seen it, is about a family struggling with an intractable problem. The mother has a mental illness, and it tears the family apart. And it's really about how this family comes together in spite of that, how the father and son cope with it, how the mother copes with it. My philosophy, and this is nothing new, is that for movies to succeed and work, they have to have an emotional center. They have to really resonate. And I was more interested in crafting a story that would connect, again, character based philosophy, than recreating my own life. It was very personal. I mean, there are things that happen in my life that are in the movie, and then there are things that happen in the movie that are not in my life. And I chose not to introduce my cast as an example to my parents. I wanted to give them a wide berth to create these characters. But I think it's really about finding that emotional center, that authenticity. That's really what I tried to do. And then find a way to work with wonderful people and make it work as a film. As it's not a documentary, it's a narrative. It has to deliver on that experience. So that was really my approach.
And now the film stars Marcia Harden and Joe Pantoliano and has got great response from critics. What was it like collaborating with the cast and receiving that kind of response?
Well, thank you. Well, at first it was very intimidating, because here I was working. It's my first feature. I'm working with an Oscar-winning actress, and Joe Pantoliano had just won an Emmy for his wonderful work on The Sopranos. But what I found, though, is that I think most successful artists and actors are often the easiest to work with, because it's really about the work. And Marcia was a dream. She was incredibly brave and willing to go to some very vulnerable places. And Joe brought this mixture of humor and heartbreak that the movie really needed. So I was very grateful. I had the cast I wanted, and then for the critics to respond the way they did, and hear people love it, was extremely gratifying. I'll tell a little story. The fact that Roger Ebert liked it, he was one of the film critics that gave us a good review, and he actually invited the film to his own film festival before he passed away, and gave it the thumbs up award. And when I did my short film at Telluride, he was actually there, and I was this, impetuous film student. And when I saw him, I went up to him to see what he thought of my short film, Lena Spaghetti, and he liked it, but advice to those filmmakers: don't go up to critics and ask for reviews on the spot. I just wanted to know what he thought of the movie. And then for years later, for him to take to the film and for him to invite it to his own festival was wonderful. Very honored.
Yeah, that's very cool. Now, you filmed Canvas, as we mentioned, in South Florida with real neighborhoods and landmarks. What did it mean to bring your story home like that?
It was incredibly fulfilling. It was actually not the plan originally because, as I mentioned, it was really important to me to get the cast I wanted, and so I was willing to do whatever that took. And so initially, the plan was to film Canvas in New Jersey, on the coast in a small town not too far from Asbury Park. It was a wonderful lesson because what happened was that as we got closer to making the movie, the weather and the fact that we had water work made Florida more advantageous. And so I was able to, convince Joey and Marcia and everyone, let's do this in Florida. And they were supportive of that because that's where most of my producers were located. And so then we just decided, let's film in North Miami. Miami was where our production office was at Greenwich Studios. And again, I didn't want to it was already very personal. So I didn't want to force, hey, this has to be filmed in my hometown. But I felt like, there was something nudging me to go there because I couldn't find the locations that I needed. For me, it was important that the house, again, for those who haven't seen it, the house has to have a Florida room where Marcia's character paints. It has to have a backyard. We're a small movie, so we're not building anything. So I have to shoot interiors, exteriors. I have to see through windows. I need a neighbor's yard too, because there's a neighbor character. And I'm building a boat. All these things have to kind of fit together like a puzzle. And I couldn't find those locations in Miami, or at least not the ones that we needed. And so I told my producers, well, give me one weekend, just bear with me. And so I drove through Hollywood, where I grew up, and in a couple of days found the locations. I had a wonderful locations manager, so it wasn't just me, but I knew where things were. I knew, hey, we can film this in North Lake. It's easy to do the water work there. The only thing we couldn't find was the lighthouse because in the paintings that Marcia, her character, paints, I needed a visual motif that was easy to recognize in her artwork. And I loved the lighthouse at Billbag State Park down in Key Biscayne. So we filmed some stuff in Miami, but most of it was filmed in my hometown. And I loved that idea of being able to preserve these places that I grew up, not just the places I learned to sail with my dad, but just the streets. And I'm a firm believer that location is a character. One of my other favorite filmmakers is Victor Nunez, Flash of Green, Ruby in Paradise, and he really embodies that philosophy that a film, a story, that the sense of place is important. It informs the story. It's in the DNA of your characters, and I discovered that when I made Canvas because, I didn't know why it was important to film in Hollywood until the stars aligned and just little things like the jealousy windows and the things that we as Floridians know about that aren't really in other places, that just those details matter. And so, yeah, I'm very grateful that I got to make the film there and sort of preserve those memories, if you were.
Yeah, authenticity, it does matter for sure. Now, back in November 2025, you participated in a special screening of Canvas in Hollywood, Florida, along with a Q&A. What did returning to your hometown as an accomplished filmmaker feel like to do that?
That was incredibly meaningful, and I was very honored that Canvas was invited by the Hollywood Historical Society and the City of Hollywood to be one of the movies they screen as part of their centennial. And it just so happens that it coincided with the 20th anniversary of when we filmed the movie, and it was wonderful because some of my family members came to the screenings. We had some crew members there, and it was a bit of a reunion, bring it full circle, and also the organization that provided the artwork for the movie, Nine Muses, came and had a sort of a mini gallery because it was important to me that the artwork that Marcia's character, the mother in the movie, was all done by people who are living with mental illness. And that's really what the movie's about. You know, each character is sublimating their pain and their issues into art. And that's really what I think art is how do you turn pain into something positive? And all the characters do that. The father builds a sailboat, the mother is painting, and the son does something that I won't reveal, but you know, for those who haven't seen it. And it was incredibly meaningful to be able to come back and again, you know, brought it all full circle.
Yeah. Now, how important is it for you to see Florida's film community thrive? And what advice would you share with emerging filmmakers today?
Florida's film community is extremely important to me. It's, you know, it's a community of artists and craftspeople, and I think it's vital to have that, to have a base where people can share and contribute. And I think it's one of the things I miss when I'm in Los Angeles. You know, my wife and I, we have a home in South Florida, and I would love to spend more time there. And I'm grateful for all the work that you and Sandy and everyone at Film Florida does to kind of create that community and connect people. And I think it's not just about an incentive to bring movies there as much as to foster that community, which is so important. And even this podcast, I have to congratulate you guys because you've had some wonderful artists on, and it's a great place to just hear others share their stories, and we all have this affinity and love for Florida, and it's so diverse. And so I've been enjoying hearing the stories that you guys have been sharing. But I think that community is really important, and the older I get, the more I long for that, and hope that I can again bring the next one to Florida and continue to make it more viable so that those of us who sometimes have to leave Florida, we don't have to leave as much. Maybe we can continue to stay and work in Florida.
Yeah. Well, talk about that next one that I know you're trying to figure out how to do here. I know you can't share too much about the story, but you have an Oscar-winning producer attached. Share a little bit about the partnership and the goal of filming in South Florida.
Yeah, so I am a little nervous about sharing too much at this stage because it's still early, but I'm happy to share something, which is, you know, it's called Solo. It's about an aging sailor who is in Florida, so it's a South Florida story. And yes, I'm very honored to be collaborating with Jonathan Sanger. He's an incredible producer. He produced The Elephant Man, Vanilla Sky, most recently Cabrini. And he's attracted to and has made so many wonderful films that are inspired by real people. And he's attracted to stories that are uplifting. And those are the stories that I'm attracted to. And incredibly honored that he's involved. And we're still building the team. We've got some other people that we're in the process of cementing those relationships, and deals are being drafted. So it takes a village to make a movie, and we're building that team. And but yeah, you know, Florida is the maritime capital of the world, and here's a story about a sailor, and it just makes perfect sense for. And part of the movie, you know, it's not just about logistics. You know, it really is a Florida story because this guy is from that region, and I actually read about it when I was working on Canvas. It was an article in the paper, so that's how long this process takes. It takes a while to get these movies made, and yeah, I hope to be able to bring the movie there and film as much of it as I can, and I think it'll be a better film as a result.
Yeah. Now, Joe, where can our listeners learn more about you and your projects and everything you have going on?
Sure. Well, I guess for updates, they can follow me on Instagram at the Joseph Greco, and also go to my website, joegreco.com, and subscribe. And we're excited to share announcements and casting calls and all those things as they come together. And so that would be what I'd encourage people to do. And I appreciate you allowing me the opportunity to share my story. And for those who haven't seen Canvas, you know, check it out. Hope you like it. And thank you all for what you're doing for Florida.
Of course, of course. Well, thanks for being with us today to share your story and taking time. And we appreciate your support for filming in Florida. And just want to say thanks for being on the Film Florida podcast.
No, it's my pleasure. Take care. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Film Florida podcast. For more information about Film Florida, go to filmflorida.org and like or follow our social media pages. If you're not already a member of Film Florida, please consider joining at filmflorida.org. Please also consider going to our website and donating $20.26 for our 2026 fundraising campaign. Check out the Film Florida merchandise at filmflorida.creator-spring.com, and please remember to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast.